Hi, I'm Bill Osmulski. Welcome to the MacIver Report. This is our weekly podcast where we talk about all the great content that we've been producing at the MacIver Institute. And it's been a really big week, so we've been cranking out the content. Let's not forget that on Monday, President Trump was sworn in. And then we also had Governor Evers' State of the State address on Wednesday. So big stories nationally and here in the state. So again, it's me and
Mike Lucas, policy analyst.
Great. Thank you for being with us, Mike. You and me, we always team up on this. So let's run through our stories. Today is January 24th, 2025. And our first story is Donald Trump's second inauguration. Ran just a standard news story on this one. All of the Republican congressmen from Wisconsin applauded it. And our two Democrat Congress people did not even go to Washington, D.C., Gwen Moore and Mark Pocan. Follow them on Twitter. You'll get to know Gwen Moore and Mark Pocan very well. They're pretty out there. They're very radical, and they're very open about that. So not surprising that they didn't show up.
Yep.
See, and already Democrats across the country are organizing their resistance. We had a story about Josh Call joined 18 other Democrat attorneys general from across the country. They're upset because the EPA is considering dialing back their PFAS regulations. PFAS are it's chemicals. It's a type of it's a hard type of plastic. It's in everything. The article explains it's in nonstick pans, it's in firefighting foam, fast food wrappers, you name it. Up until 2021, there were no environmental requirements for it. The EPA put those regulations in place in 2021. Talking about rolling them back, Democrats say those chemicals cause cancer. Not a ton of science to back up that claim, but the science is whatever Democrats say the science is, and now that Trump's in office, he needs to. They need to protect us from him. So,
yeah.
Mike, did you have anything on this?
This is a trending health concern. No one's been talking about this except for the last however many months. Is definitely. There's just not a lot to this. So, first thing we could say about the science and how they determine that this is, actually has a negative health effect is they're not doing like a randomized clinical trial where they have, a placebo group and then, their intervention group, and they're giving the intervention group PFAS. You can't do that. You're not going to get approval for that, because if you suspect that something is harmful, no one's going to let you intentionally, harm people by feeding them, or administering to them a dangerous substance. The only way they know this is likely because they're looking at the prevalence of PFAS and whatever it is, and they're, basically deriving a correlation between that and XYZ health effects. And saying, here's a positive correlation between, this chemical and health outcomes. And that's really it. It's very, very likely that this is just an epidemiological study where you're just finding a correlation between two things and then deriving a causal relationship from that.
Yeah,
and that's it.
Yeah,
epidemiology is garbage, as we know from the last.
Well, this kind of feeds into a theme that we'll be talking about. We might be talking about a little bit later on here, because Governor Evers gave a State of the State and had a bunch of, he threw out a bunch of claims out there, and he doesn't. The governor is not, to his credit, he doesn't completely make this stuff up out of thin air. He's got liberal think tanks that make it up out of thin air.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that we keep on picking up here is, liberal think tank puts out press release, or in the case of Governor Evers, they put the links to these studies. And the studies are all garbage.
Yeah.
They're like 2 to 4 page PDFs with, vague sources, no methodology, just, and like those claims, like you said, where it's, they kind of like make correlation, even though there is no way to prove causation between the two, and they don't make any attempts to prove it. It just, cancer rates are up in the United States, and oh, we've got
what
all
else
these
is up at the
PFAS,
same
yeah.
time? Yeah, so there must be a relationship there. No, you can't derive anything definitive from a correlation. Correlation does not imply causation. If you do discover a correlation, then you can establish a hypothesis, which you can then investigate and look for a causal relationship.
yeah.
But you can't use statistics in order to determine cause and effect unless your correlation is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
Like smoking cigarettes and small cell lung cancer. That's a really, really strong correlation. You can pretty much, derive cause and effect from that.
Yeah.
Because the one only occurs when the other is present. But, I mean, you can find spurious correlations between anything, absolutely anything. And, I don't lend any sort of credence to this finding. It could be true. I mean, lots of chemicals out there. A lot of them probably aren't good for you, but I mean, just your overall exposure to PFAS, is it really that significant that it's going to explain cancer or heart disease or whatever else? It's not likely.
Yeah, we'll let Bobby Kennedy Jr.
Yeah, RFK can handle that one.
I reserve my thoughts on this until he's weighed in. So, all right, next one we've got the MacIver Institute Guide to the 2025-27 state budgets. So, this is you can find this on our research tab. You can find this by going to our policies and pulling up the state budgets page. We're going to do our best to keep this at the top of those pages so it's easy to find, but with this flashy logo, it definitely stands out. Yep. So state budget, that's going to just dominate. That's going to dominate everything that goes on in Madison over the next year. Obviously, the state Supreme Court race is going to be competing for that attention, but this is the main thing that the legislature and the governor are going to be doing this year, is creating the budget for the next 2 years, the biennial budget. Now, it's an intimidating topic. We know. We've covered it for a long time. So in this coverage, it presents it in an approachable way. You don't have to know anything at all about state finance or budgeting or anything like that. You are, that's a starting point for this. Why do we have a state budget? What is a state budget about? What is it supposed to cover? Where does it get money from? Goes through all that. It's not terribly long, given how quickly I'm bringing you guys all up to speed. But and this is going to kind of be like the cornerstone for our coverage as the budget debate unfolds. So lots of different. We're going to continue to update it, include hyperlinks to individual pieces, and letting you know where we're at in the budget process. So. And I don't want to spoil everything for you, but I just want to kind of run through real quick my 6 recommendations at the end of this piece, just to kind of keep this front and center so that we can continue to try to shape the debate on this as it unfolds. So first, Supreme Court, they actually are going to have a huge impact on the state budget, whether people realize it yet or not. But there's a case right there on rulemaking. Governor Evers is suing the legislature because he doesn't think lawmakers should have any say or oversight over what rules and regulations his bureaucrats write. If the Supreme Court rules in his favor, the legislature is going to have to completely rethink how they fund the bureaucracy, because if bureaucrats can write whatever rule or regulation they want, which has the force of law, then the legislature is going to have to start removing the resources that they need in order to do that. Performance-based budgeting. This is something I've been preaching about for a while. This is the idea that agencies should be their budgets should be determined by their performance, as opposed to just giving them more money every year, regardless of what results they're producing. Eliminate appropriations that require ongoing oversight. This was another Supreme Court fight that the legislature lost. Previously, they would allocate large amounts of money for certain things, namely stewardship, and then they would disperse that money on a case-by-case basis throughout the biennium, and the agency would have to request it. The Supreme Court says you can't do that, so that means that the legislature needs to stop appropriating that money and just, until the agencies come up and say, hey, we need money for that. That should be a supplemental appropriation bill after the budget is passed. Agency mission statements. Currently, there is Agencies write their own mission statements. That means that bureaucrats essentially decide what they should be doing for a living. That needs to stop. The legislature needs to write those into law so that rather than DPI deciding what its job is, it should be us, the people, through our legislature saying, hey, DPI, your job is to educate kids to these specific standards.
If we wrote the mission statements for these agencies, are those binding, like by law?
So currently it's not, because it's just internal. If the legislature was to write mission statements for these agencies and put it in the budget, that would be binding. That would be, this is your mission.
And then you could assess them based on whether they've
exactly
achieved or fulfilled their mission.
Yeah, currently, because they write their own mission statements right now, they write their own performance measures. So you're kind of judging that. They kind of decide what they're going to be judged on. They just aren't held accountable to their own standards.
Yeah.
I'm saying that we need to set the standards for them and hold them accountable for them.
Okay. Yeah.
New school funding and shared revenue formulas. Look, the school funding formula was established in the mid-'90s. The shared revenue formula, which limits how much property taxes local governments can collect, that was established 20 years ago. Nobody likes these formulas. Nobody. There is universal desire to redo them. I think now is the time that we should be talking about this because, we've got a new presidential administration where the reason why Trump was elected in large part was because people are sick of the status quo. They want to see major reforms. They want to change the way that we approach government and being governed.
Yeah.
So this is a great opportunity because you've got the public support to start tackling tough issues like school funding and shared revenue. And like I said, 100% support for, trashing those formulas and starting over, but there's also always a ton of support for maintaining the status quo, even when the status quo is terrible.
So how is shared revenue or school funding done now? Is it just like across the board flat for every school, or how does that work?
Very, very complicated formulas for schools. It has a lot to do with student population. So, they take new numbers every year, and theirs is mostly based off of student population. For local governments, it's a lot of it's based off of, again, complicated formulas. Part of it is 20% of all the sales tax collected throughout the state goes straight to the communities. Some of this has to do with, spending levels at the local level. They're very convoluted.
Okay.
So hard to understand. It would be nice to be, and they're very dynamic too. So especially with schools never know how much aid they're getting from the government, usually until after their budget is passed or right up to it. That's why schools don't even have their budgets ready until 4 months into the fiscal year.
Okay.
So it's something that definitely needs to be addressed. And like I said, I think now is the time to do it.
Yeah.
And then let Evers veto the whole budget. He's threatening to do it. So if he doesn't get what he likes, let him. Because, as we talked about before, the way that budget math works, if we just did a cost to continue budget, which we would have to do if Evers vetoed the whole budget, that would actually come out to less spending over the next 2 years than we've done for the current 2 year budget. So, call his bluff. It's time to play some hardball.
Cool.
All right, next story. We got Evers State of the State. Hey, if you don't follow us at newsmaciver.com on Twitter, you really need to. I was there pretty much fact-checking this speech in real time the best I could. It's always hard with liberals and with government officials in general because everything a government official tells you merits being fact-checked these days. I mean, you can't even take just, what seem to be innocuous facts, for face value anymore.
Yeah.
This is kind of a preview of his budget address he's going to be giving next month. But, the major things were your kids belong to the government. They're the government's responsibility. You shouldn't have to worry about them. We need more money for schools, more money for daycares. He's going to fight Trump on everything. Deportations, his green energy, reforms, LGBTQ, abortion, everything. So much for the will of the people being the law of the land.
Yep.
And then red flag laws.
Spent quite a bit of time on that one.
He did. Your eyes kind of glaze over after you talked about it for, 10, 15 minutes. But, when I actually did the word counts this morning. He talked about gun control more than any other issue.
Ah, okay.
So, yeah, that's definitely a priority. He wants red flag law. I mean, they part of the challenge with fact checking this stuff is they don't, the different types of lies and misrepresentations that politicians will throw at you these days. So, like, Evers will say something like, we need to make sure that domestic abusers don't have firearms.
Yep.
Well, okay. If you're looking,
which begs the question.
Yeah. So part of this is perception. What do you think when you think of domestic abuse?
Yeah.
You think of somebody that, beat their spouse, sexually assaulted their spouse, or is, stalking an ex.
Right.
And
yep.
all three of those things are felonies.
Yes.
Which means if you've been convicted of domestic abuse like that, it's already illegal for you to own a firearm.
Right.
Now, so that's the first thing. But let's unpeel this. Let's explore this for a minute. So if you go through the Wisconsin statutes, and there's a section where it says, what it means by domestic abuse, and usually that's for other services and things like that. Domestic abuse could also mean property damage.
Mm-hmm.
That's a misdemeanor, so you could have a gun.
Right.
But what is property damage? Is it your wife throwing a dish on the floor and breaking it because she's mad at you?
Mm-hmm.
Is that domestic abuse? These become very open ended.
Yeah.
Physical abuse or some kind of physical, violence.
Mm-hmm.
So like, if you shoved your wife or your wife shoved you in the heat of an argument, that is qualifies you for domestic abuse for certain government definitions. And then the threat of any of these. Yeah. So let's say there's a woman out there who 10 years ago threatened to key her ex's car because she caught him cheating on him. Mm-hmm. Threatened. That's domestic abuse. So if you if you start unpeeling the layers of this and, you go, okay, anyone that's ever been, convicted or, you can make it really good. So it's just like a police report. Mm-hmm. Hey, there's a police report that you threatened to, break your boyfriend's PlayStation.
Yeah.
You can't own a gun now. Not in the state of Wisconsin. Obviously, all this stuff would be challenged, but you can kind of see the slippery slope that we start getting on with this type of stuff. So was Evers just simply misrepresenting a fact, where, felons can't have guns to kind of build support because, well, yeah, of course, everyone would agree people that are committed to domestic abuse shouldn't be allowed to have guns, of course.
Right.
Well, they already can't. So,
but yeah, gives the impression that we're such, gun-loving Second Amendment people that, we don't have anything in place already to address these sort of things.
Yeah, or everyone needs to have a background check to buy a gun.
Yeah, you already have to. Yeah. It's already required. Anyone, they're preying on your ignorance because people who are, for gun control don't own guns, so they have absolutely no understanding of fundamentally how a firearm works, and definitely have no understanding of the process you go through in order to acquire a firearm. If you want to buy a gun, every single time that you go in to purchase a gun, you have to go through a federal background check that gets sent to the FBI. And, it could take 10 minutes, it could take 5 days, it could take 2 weeks, right? But this is universal throughout the United States. You have to go through a criminal background check. And felonies are an immediate disqualifier. And every felon knows this, too. Yeah.
And as it is right now, even if you aren't convicted of a felony, let's say that your ex has filed charges against you. Like you've just been charged with something. You weren't allowed to own guns.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the judge gets to put the requirements like, hey, initial hearing, you cannot have, You're out on signature bond, but you can't have access to any guns.
Yeah, because you're a risk, right? Until, we find out, if you're guilty or not.
Exactly. So, just another case of...
just opens up a huge can of worms, and red flags lead to false flags, too. Just think. You have a crazy neighbor, okay? And, maybe you're a hunter or something, and you just got back from a hunt. You're, taking your rifle out of your car or something like that. Like, oh my gosh, my neighbor is wielding a firearm. He's out in public and he's going like there. That's a red flag. Cops show up.
Yeah.
Whatever, she or he, but it's probably a Karen, right?
Yeah. And
who's calling in.
There's now a police report about you.
Now there's a police report. That's a red flag. Hey, take your firearms. This is how it works.
Yeah. And this reminds me too of like the whole swatting concept.
Swatting. Oh my gosh.
Just make a false report. Hey, my neighbor's got a gun and he's threatening to shoot people.
Yeah.
And so, they send the SWAT team and they hope that the SWAT team shoots you, because those are dangerous situations.
Yeah. Millennials and younger know a lot about this because of, Twitch streamers, video game streamers being swatted, right? Where as a joke, someone on stream will, dox whoever's streaming or whatever, and then as a report, raise a red flag, and there are dozens and dozens of cases of video gamers playing a video game in their apartment and SWAT breaking down their doors, training their guns on them, right? Throwing flashbangs through it, and it's only possible because of these red flag laws.
Yeah, so
huge opportunity for abuse. I mean.
Yeah, so while we're on Governor Evers and kind of making up things, this was one of your reports.
Yeah. So.
So tell us about this one.
So during his address, he was talking about the year of the worker. We've had 7 months of record-breaking, employment in Wisconsin. And here's the thing. So using the federal government's own numbers collected by the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, using their own numbers for Wisconsin created 15,800 jobs from January through November. We now have December numbers, but at the time he was giving this address, we didn't have December numbers. During that 11-month period, 7,800 of those were government jobs. That's 49.6%. So using their own numbers, half the jobs created in Wisconsin were government jobs. That is just a fundamental sign of economic sickness in any economy. As a rule of thumb, you want government job growth to be no more than 20%. And exceeding that 20% threshold is actually a very, very significant sign of recession. So nationwide, government job growth has been more than 20% for, can't remember how many months, but let's say 6 months out of the last 12 months, it's been over 20%. Obviously, people understand when they, are looking at their checkbooks or looking at their finances that you're not really doing very well right now. At the exact same time that government is trying to grow and grow and grow in order to, support this illusion that, the economy is actually doing really well. Look at all these jobs we have. When Evers and the Department of Workforce Development are reporting on these employment numbers, they're including those government jobs, but government jobs are not productive. They do not produce value, and they cannot produce value because government jobs exist outside of the price system, right? You don't know if a government job is profitable because governments don't earn profit, right? They collect taxes, they spend revenue. And that's it. So December's numbers came out. These are the preliminary numbers. So for all of 2024, after adjusting for job growth in the month of December, using their own numbers, 24% of jobs have been government jobs. Okay. Here's what you have to understand about this survey. These numbers come from the Establishment Survey. And what the BLS does is they reach out to employers, private and public sector employers, so state agencies, federal agencies, and then private businesses. And they ask them, how many jobs do you have on your payroll? Okay? And the Establishment Survey just counts up the number of jobs on payroll. But that doesn't actually tell you how many people have jobs, because someone could be on, say, MacIver, on our payroll, we could have 2 jobs that are worked by the same person. So that's 2 jobs. That people think that means 2 people are employed. Not necessarily. Someone could be on, one business's payroll and on another business's payroll. So you have double counting going on here. It's much more reliable to look at the household survey, which actually reaches out to individuals and asks them, do you have a job? The household survey is far from perfect, but it's imminently superior to the establishment survey, which Evers and the DWD rely on. So you really cannot get a good idea of, how many people are employed in Wisconsin, because we don't ask people if they're employed. We just look at how many jobs are on payrolls, and only from a select, subsample of employers. So,
yeah, it's and it's great at showing too, like just how easy it is for public officials to kind of like craft the narrative that they want by looking at data from a certain angle. I mean, we were just talking about correlation versus causation. I mean, sometimes they'll just throw out, hey, according to the Wisconsin Policy Forum, everything's awesome.
Right.
And you just, who are you going to believe? This liberal think tank or your own lying eyes?
Yeah. And the other thing that I talk about, if you read the full article, which is Evers' Economy as a Soviet Dream, is we have data on the number of weekly hours worked. So in that same establishment survey, they count the number of jobs on payroll, but then they ask employers, how many hours did you charge to each payroll job? And what you see going back for the last 4 years is that the average number of weekly hours that are being billed or charged to each payroll job has been going down every single month. Every single month. And that's month over month. So they ask, hey, how many hours did this job work? And they say, oh, worked 40 hours. Next month they come back. How many hours did this same job work? 39 hours. Then the next month, 38, then 37, then 36. So look at that original article, and it becomes very clear that based on the number of hours being recorded for each of these jobs, that we are no longer in a position of abundant private sector full-time jobs. We are now in an area of people working part-time jobs and picking up multiple part-time jobs. That is assured. So it does not matter at all how many jobs are on payrolls. It doesn't matter if we have 7 months of record-breaking employment levels, because you're double counting. You're double counting people. So what Wisconsin should do, what the DWD should do, they have this data, they should do their own household survey. Why don't you reach out to 60,000 people in Wisconsin every single month and ask them if they have a job?
Hey, you might
of course, they don't want to do that.
Yeah, exactly. You might find the data they're using is saying exactly what they want it to say. So why would they want to actually get to the truth?
Yeah.
All right. So what do we have next? Oh yeah, and talking about these liberal think tanks. This is another one that I just want to point out. So Evers loves to point at the Wisconsin Policy Forum's study, how tax burden is only 9% of Wisconsin, it's some of the lowest it's ever been. Everything's great in Wisconsin. I point out, right away that, those numbers, they disclude government licenses and fees, so that's distorting what we're actually paying to government. When you include all of our licensing and fees that we pay to the government, you're getting closer to 15% of our income goes to state and local government. But this was another thing that should be that needs to be brought up, and it's income versus expense increases in Wisconsin. This is part of the article. Hold the applause. There's more to the story about Wisconsin's tax burden. You can see that over the past 2 years, that both the increased cost of goods and the increased cost of services has far outpaced the increase in personal income.
Yep.
So like this past year, you had the most recent year that BLS had for this survey was 2022, and incomes in Wisconsin increased by about 2.5%, whereas the price of goods had increased by 10% and the price of services increased by 9.5%. So, if you're wondering why, how can it be that Governor Evers is bragging about how everything is great in Wisconsin, how the tax burden is the lowest it's ever been, but things, when you're sitting at your kitchen table with your not your checkbook anymore, but and trying to figure out where's our money going. Yeah, it's this is where it's going. It's you are not keeping up with the increased cost of living.
Yeah. And here's the thing, everyone knows this on an individual level, yet politicians, people on the left are deluding themselves into, ignoring their own experience.
Yeah. Who are you going to believe, me or your own lying eyes?
And the common refrain, the rejoinder to that is like, well, that's anecdotal. Dude, data is just anecdotes. If I have 2 anecdotes, that's data. That's not insignificant, right? If you live in your town and you talk to 20 people and you ask them, hey, how are you? Are you richer this year? Or were you richer last year? And they say, I'm definitely poorer this year. Is that just immaterial? It doesn't mean anything?
Yeah, subjective research. It's got a place.
Yeah. So,
all right.
At a certain point, people just they want to believe what they want to believe, and go ahead. And the result of that is that you're hurting people.
Well, and it's got a benefit too for a liberal politician because it's also isolating people.
Yes.
Oh, the economy's everyone's doing great. Why am I sucking? There's something wrong with me.
Yeah.
It's psychological, but
yeah.
All right, sticking on Evers, we got Governor Evers post-constitutional Wisconsin. This has been a major theme that I have been hitting on repeatedly because I've been following Evers since day one, and I've just been like completely in awe of how relentless his attacks on the state constitution have been. And I know like people are gonna say, oh well, like Governor Gavin Newsom's far more of a threat than Tony Evers is, or Jamie Pritzker's got a further a tighter hold on Illinois than Evers does. Well, here's the difference: those governors aren't trying to fundamentally alter the constitutional structure of their states. Governor Evers is constantly violating the Constitution and trying to strip constitutional powers away from the legislature. So, MacIver News Minutes, I address this topic yet again. Just running through, my top 6. During COVID, he tried to suspend the elections. He didn't have the constitutional authority to do that, the spring elections. And in the process, he tried to extend the terms of those offices that were on the ballot indefinitely. And those terms are defined by the Constitution, so that was, 2 strikes with 1 action. His emergency orders, he was just trying to seize power away from the legislature. He only had the authority to issue 1 60-day emergency order, and if he wanted it to go longer, he had to get the legislature's approval. Instead, he just thought he could, start issuing them back to back, and he did that until the Supreme Court told him he couldn't. Legislative maps, that's the legislature's constitutional authority to draw those maps. Evers wrestled that away from them, and he got to draw the maps this time. Legislative power of the purse, talked about that briefly before. That was eroded, not completely taken away, but the legislature has less power over the purse than they did a year ago. Legislative rulemaking oversight, that's that case playing out in the Supreme Court now. And then the direct democracy amendment. So Evers knows that even if he gets a situation where his bureaucrats write whatever rule or regulation they want, he can only stretch that so far. The bureaucrats can't say, there's no law saying this, but the law says that marijuana is illegal, but we're going to write a regulation that makes it legal. He knows that that's just a bridge too far.
Yeah.
So what he wants to do is he wants a constitutional amendment that allows the people to present amendments to the Constitution and vote on them completely independent of the legislature and the governor, and he knows that he'll be able to mobilize the mob to push through his priorities on that. So that's Governor Evers post-constitutional Wisconsin. He is being very successful with that, and we'll see how far he's able to take it before someone finally, before either the legislature grows a pair or the Supreme Court, says, this is too far even for us, Tony. Governor Evers, how Governor Evers might drain the swamp in Madison. Video report, there's a MacIver News Minute on this, and there's also a video report about that Supreme Court case I've been talking about. That pretty much when the Supreme Court addressed this last week, they were openly talking about, hey, you know what? It turns out that there is nothing in the state constitution that says bureaucrats can write rules and regulations. And there's also nothing in the Constitution that says the legislature can give their law-writing authority to the executive branch to allow the bureaucrats to write rules and regulations. So, it was pointed out that if the Supreme Court were to actually go off of the Constitution, the administrative state would collapse. It would just have to go. Now, so obviously the Supreme Court's run by liberals. They aren't going to want to do that. But, that's kind of if they go for what the Constitution actually says, that's what they'd have to do. I've talked about how if they say the legislature doesn't have the authority to actually police those powers that they've given to the executive branch, then the legislature is just going to have to start defunding the bureaucracy and writing very detailed laws to prevent that. And the defense attorney also mentioned that, this debate actually played out at the federal level because there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that says that bureaucrats can write rules and regulations either.
Yeah.
And there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that says that the legislative branch can give that power to bureaucrats.
Right.
So this played out in the U.S. Supreme Court, and Scalia actually stepped in and said, look, if we go with the original, I am not going to go with what's actually in the Constitution on this, because if I do, the entire government will collapse. And I'm not going to allow the government to collapse, even if the Constitution doesn't allow this government to exist as it currently is.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, that's how it played out at the federal level, where, in a sense, we are already in a post-constitutional United States just because of that ruling, and it's,
Yep.
Hillsdale grad, any...
what was... Well, this was this... I don't know what this Scalia one was called, what that court...
Yeah, I don't... I mean, it was one of those... I didn't look it up.
But the Chevron decision had something to do with that, right?
See, all I know is what the defense attorney was. He was kind of talking about, if you guys decide to go this certain route, this is how it played out in the federal government.
Which was a great clip. Great clip, by the way. Because, that is the conclusion of deciding this way, which is that, hey, the whole bureaucracy is going to collapse. So you would better arrive at a reasonable, albeit maybe not entirely constitutional decision, but that is the result, because the bureaucracy has their power because we have delegated authority to them. So give them all of our authority, or not our authority, but give them this sort of immunity, this power to write their own rules and regulations without oversight, and we'll just get rid of it because that's the option you leave us with.
Well, it's, I've brought this up a couple of times. It's a status quo.
Yeah.
There is strong investment in maintaining the status quo. Even when nobody likes the status quo, even when the status quo is unconstitutional, there are always going to be strong forces out there and a strong inclination to just keep things going just like they are.
Yep. Devil sort of thing.
Yeah. All right. So here is one of the news stories that we put out this week. This was from a Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce survey. They found that a large portion of their respondents said that, hey, somebody needs to make healthcare more affordable. It's becoming a problem. The survey apparently doesn't say what they say needs to be done to fix healthcare costs, just that they need to be fixed. This is one of those moments where you gotta keep an eye on from a free market advocate's perspective. You got to keep an eye on businesses just as much as anyone else.
Yep. Because
businesses like to do things that aren't necessarily free market. They want the government to become bigger in a lot of cases. This is probably one of them. They're just because it's business friendly and free market are not the same things. So I figured this is a great opportunity to just kind of point that out.
Yeah. Businesses are not ideologically capitalists. They are capitalists in effect. They exist within the structure of capitalism. But I mean, just look at your billionaires, Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett. All these guys come out and say, "I don't mind paying more in taxes," right? I pay very little in taxes. You go ahead and charge me more. And they probably say that because good PR on the one hand, but also they believe it. It's in their private lives, that's the way they feel, but in their business lives, they exist and function as capitalists, for the most part. But, Amazon, for example, is a good example, receiving subsidies and, during the COVID era. You gotta keep a check on businesses. It is in their interest to cartelize and to monopolize because the state is willing to, hear them on those issues and, receive some of the proceeds from giving them those privileges. So you do have to watch out.
Yes, I mean, businesses are always looking to gain a competitive advantage over their competition.
Yes.
And being free market means insisting everybody plays by the same rules. Now, a lot of times businesses are going to go to government to try to get the rules written in their favor, trying to stack the deck.
Yes.
And that's one of the main things that we're trying to prevent at places like the MacIver Institute is, hey, everyone's got to play by the same rules. Free market doesn't mean anarchy.
Yeah.
Because I like to bring up China because we're talking about free market naturally leads to the idea of free trade. And I always point out you cannot have free trade. The United States cannot have free trade with a country like China because China's entire economy is based off of slave labor. So they play by a different set of rules, which so that's part of the one of the examples and part of that calculation you have to make when you're trying to determine free market policies and free market solutions.
Yeah. And to speak specifically about healthcare, there's an equivocation going on here, so 41% of respondents answered make healthcare more affordable. Without a doubt, when people think of healthcare, they think of health insurance. We do not need healthcare reform in this country. We need health insurance reform. It is totally a mistake, and it is a huge drain on the healthcare industry to have everything going through health insurance, which is exactly what is done, right? Everyone goes up to their doctor's office, they present their health insurance information, you pay your copay. That is responsible for healthcare costs. All of your healthcare is being rerouted or directed through health insurance companies. Free market has done a really great job of addressing this, in that there's a huge movement towards direct primary care physicians right now, where you're paying cash out of pocket. And there's even onesie, twosie examples here and there of entirely cash-based hospitals. For example, there's the Oklahoma Surgery Center. They do not accept insurance. They post the prices of their surgeries online, and just having that one free market hospital in Oklahoma, you as someone who needs a surgery or needs some sort of healthcare service, right? And you have health insurance, okay? You get a quote or something from your hospital through your insurance. Reach out to the Oklahoma Surgery Center. Ask them what they're going to charge. And then go back to your hospital and your health insurance provider and say, Oklahoma's going to charge me this out of pocket, $8,000. And just that stated price being out there will oftentimes be enough to have your local hospital reduce their price of service, because they do still want your business. But they also like you having insurance, because if you go through an insurance company, they can charge you a higher rate.
Yeah, and it's one of the other complaints that you get with health insurance is once you start, and this for anything, once you start, are able to start offloading some of your responsibility on someone else
to a third party,
you're always going to want more. So there's people out there that complain about any copays at all. They go to the doctor.
Oh, yeah.
What do you mean I got to pay $10 for this doctor's appointment? It's
yeah.
Well, it's your copay. Oh, I shouldn't have to pay anything. Well, that's. Yeah. So those complaints are pretty common out there, actually.
Yeah. But remember what Friedman said: you don't spend someone else's money as carefully or as well as you spend your own, and that's exactly what a third-party health insurance system does. So direct primary care, Yeah.
All right. So we got another one. We got the Wisconsin's largest teachers union pushes state Supreme Court to take up Act 10 case. Act 10 is going to be a big theme this year because of the Supreme Court race. Act 10 has been around for 12, 13 years now. It's saved Wisconsinites over $30 billion, both in taxes, but also in service levels. I always have to stress that because before Act 10, in order to keep up with these union contracts, a lot of local governments and schools, they couldn't tax anymore, so they were just starting to cut services. So that was, the only way that they were able to actually pay this off. Act 10 came along, busted up the government unions. Suddenly, taxpayers were back in charge of their governments to some extent. So a lot of cost-saving measures. The union buses were no longer running government in Wisconsin. So anyway, obviously the liberals have hated this ever since. With a liberal-controlled Supreme Court, they've decided they can dig up old cases that were settled 10 years ago and bring them back up again. So December, a Dane County judge overturned Act 10, but he stayed the decision because he was afraid that if unions rush and start negotiating new contracts, then the legislature appeals this and gets it overturned in an appeals court. Well, that's going to create all kinds of chaos in the contract negotiating process. So I want this thing to be settled, but here it is. He laid out that card. Now the teachers union is going to the Supreme Court and saying, hey, take this case up. Pull it up directly. Don't let this thing just sit out there and go through the appeals process. Pull this thing up right away so that you can settle this. So there's a picture of the teachers occupying the state capitol back in 2011 because, in their own words, what's good for the teachers is good for the kids, so Screw the kids. All right. You got to say
I just got to say one thing. If you believe that public school teachers are really good at their jobs, show up to your local high school and ask for a visitor's pass and sit in on a class. Do that.
All right. Well, we will talk. I know this is a common topic, so we'll come back to it again before too long, I'm sure. All right, next story we got. Speaking of this, academic standards. DPI, Jill Underly, is the state superintendent of Wisconsin Public Schools, Department of Public Instruction secretary, and completely revamped how schools and students are evaluated on their academic performance. So prior to that, we were at like 30 to 40%, depending on your school. If you're in Milwaukee, it was more like 0 to 10% of students were proficient in English and math. That's terrible. I mean, parents look at that. What do you mean only 30% of these kids, the kids in this school are proficient? So DPI, year after year went by. We keep giving historic increases to public instruction, and the numbers never change. They're always floating right around that area. So DPI decided, we're going to completely shuffle all the cards in the deck. So they've changed what it means to be proficient, but they changed the standards in a way where you can't really compare the previous, 10 years of standards to the new scale of what it means to be proficient. It doesn't line up. You cannot make fair comparisons.
Yep.
So, in a sense, it was starting off at, ground zero, day one, all over again. Republicans say, hey, you need to put those standards back in place.
Yeah.
So that was one of the stories. And then also we got Dan O'Donnell's column, A Question of Standards. Governor Evers says he's opposed to the new lower standards as well. So that's, that's kind of an interesting curveball. Mm-hmm. You want to weigh in first, or should I?
Go ahead.
All right. So why is Governor Evers suddenly on the same side as the Wisconsin Republican-led legislature on school standards? Why is he taking their side against Jill Underly? Because Governor Evers doesn't like Jill Underly. I mean,
okay.
Anyone's guess as to why, but he has come out against her. So she's running for re-election for this spring for state superintendent. He has come out against her. Because the liberal running against her is more crazy and radical than she is. So that's my, I'm inclined to believe that, he just needs to go with the craziest liberal for the position. But, Anyway, so he doesn't like Underly, so he's gonna, that was a convenient excuse to take a jab at her.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
A little bit of drama in the DPI. I like it. I'm a fan of that. Sounds good. But two changes on not only changing the scale scores, but also an abuse of language here, changing advanced, proficient, basic, and below basic to advanced, meeting, approaching, and developing.
Yeah, see, that's what I mean.
This is just euphemistic, gobbledygook.
Yeah.
Just to obscure what it really means. I mean, at least they didn't change the number of buckets. You still have 4 buckets.
Yeah.
So, just understand that the last 2 are failing students.
Well, and it's worth pointing out, though, too, it's like, so they changed all the standards and, moved the goalpost, but they're still, like, right below 50% proficiency across the board.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's
Yes.
like, it's a little bit better, but, 50% is still an F.
Yeah.
All right. Final story. We got Dan O'Donnell. He does the text columns for us, the blog columns. He also does video columns. So just talking about Cavalier Johnson's out there and, celebrating, crime is down in Milwaukee. Everything's great. And Dan points, starts throwing some context and perspective into this. And he talks about, Milwaukee's murder rate and how, okay, it might be lower than it was last year, but let's look back, 10 years ago. So,
yeah, a decline from an all-time high is hardly improvement. That's right. That's the meat of this video, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and, this kind of is getting to the overall theme for this week's podcast is, political spin.
Yeah.
You might, even, a lot of times they're lying about the numbers themselves, but even when they're using the real numbers, they're giving them to you in a way that, is advancing their own, preferred narratives.
Yeah, and devoid of context. Sorry to talk econ, but the same thing is done with these inflation numbers. They say, when inflation is down, it makes you think that prices are falling. That's not what that means. It means that the rate of price increases are lower than they were last month. So sure, prices went up 3% last month, and this month they only went up by 2.9%. Yeah, they're down.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Carton of eggs now costs you, $6.10 instead of,
Yeah.
Well, all right. So that's our stories for the week, kind of wrapping things up here. As you can tell, just ton is going on, 100 different directions. I was just kind of talking today about, when Governor Evers gave that State of the State address, we talked about a fraction of what he put out there, in his hour speech. It was like kind of he just dumped a whole pile of work on our desks of things we need to go through, facts we need to check out. President Trump, he is on a rampage right now through the federal government. So there's all of that. Those factors are coming into play. So yeah, this is the busy season for politics and public policy. So in other words, you're going to want to keep tuning into the MacIver report. So for this, for this week. Thank you for joining us this week on the MacIver Report. I'm Bill Osmulski. I was joined by our economist, Michael Lucas, and we'll be back next week to bring you everything that's going to go on over next week's another crazy week in the news, I'm sure. Have a good weekend.